Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Christina Nosti, the Events and Marketing Director at Miami's independently owned bookstore, Books and Books, and it's my immense pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Rebecca Solnit to celebrate the publication of Waking Beauty, a fresh feminist adaptation of a classic fairy tale published by our friends at Haymarket Books. Writer, historian, and activist Rebecca Solnit is the author of more than 20 books on feminism, Western and Indigenous history, popular power, social change and insurrection, wandering and walking, hope and disaster, including Call Them by Their True Names, winner of the 2018 Kirkus Prize for Nonfiction, Cinderella Liberator, Men Explain Things to Me, Hope in the Dark, The Faraway Nearby, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, Wanderlost, A History of Walking, and River of Shadows, Edward Muybridge and the Technological Wild West, for which she received a Guggenheim, the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism, and the Lannan Literary Award. To moderate this afternoon's conversation, we're joined by Donna Seaman, the editor for adult books at Booklist, a member of the content leadership team for the American Writers Museum, and a recipient of the Louis Shore Award for Excellence in Book Reviewing, the James Friend Memorial Award for Literary Criticism, and the Studs Terkel Humanities Service Award. She created the anthology In Our Nature, Stories of Wildness. Her author interviews are collected in Writers on the Air, Conversations About Books, and she's the author of Identity Unknown, Rediscovering 7 American Women Artists. As you listen, remember to post your questions for the speaker in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And we thank you for ordering your copy of Waking Beauty from Books and Books and supporting independent bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome. Hello.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I can't wait to see Donna.
Trying to get Donna on here. So you know what? Let me just try reprompting her. These things sometimes happen. Congratulations, Rebecca. I mean, it's so fantastic to have you with us. You're someone independent booksellers admire immensely. We love you, and you've been so significant a force and such a great supporter of all of ours. So I couldn't be happier to welcome you. So trying to get Donna on. Let's see if she can reconnect. Okay. She's still not connecting. I'm not entirely sure why.
Do you want me to, maybe I'll read the opening of the story while you work on this?
I think that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. Waking Beauty. I'm still getting used to the fact that everything shows up backwards, which the illustrations to the Sleeping Beauty that the wonderful children's book illustrator and adult book illustrator Arthur Rackham made a century ago for a version of the story I didn't love, but the illustrations were amazing. So we reused them, repurposed them. So this book is in 3 sections. The first one is about the girl who becomes Sleeping Beauty. The second one about the Waking Beauty, her younger sister. And the third one brings in the fairy tale, the Firebird, and a boy named Atlas. And it begins, once upon a time, there was a child named Ida, and wild things happened to her. But that's not where the story begins. Before there was Ida, there was her mother and father, and before them, their parents, and before them. Before every beginning is another beginning. Before there is a child, there are parents. Whether she has one parent in her life or 5, or is raised by ants or wolves or elves. Ida had 2 human parents. So perhaps this story should begin twice upon a time, or since 2 parents and 1 child make 3, 3 times upon a time. And I'll stop there, although the challenge of saying the fairy godmother's names is always exciting. Hello, Donna.
Hello. I'm so relieved to be here. Thank you. I hope you can hear me all right. So, Rebecca, it's a pleasure to meet you and speak with you. Congratulations on Waking Beauty.
Thank you.
In afterward to this book, you say that fairy tales are rambling old structures full of wonder and trouble. And so you have us thinking about them as ancient houses that need renovation. I wonder if you could talk about why it would be worth renovating these old stories and why we should inhabit them.
Yeah, and we talk about magic in fairy tales. Sometimes to mean the literal magic, the fairy godmother waves her wand and things happen. All your brothers are turned into swans by your wicked stepmother, and you have to, knit sweaters for them out of stinging nettles while remaining mute to change them back. But I think there's also magic in the enchantment of the story, and that fairy tales, which these days are treated as kind of trivial and childish, are very serious business. They're about how young people or powerless people or marginalized people or devalued people struggle to find who they are, who their people are, their place in the world, the good life that they need. So they're really stories of becoming that I think are very powerful and very relevant to our time. But they come from an era in which a woman's financial destiny was mostly about who she married, and because her husband's fortune, fate, life would be her life, in which there's often a lot of snobbery, and not only the snobbery of class that wouldn't you want to be a princess or a king or marry up, but also the snobbery of beautiful people matter more than unbeautiful people. Good people are beautiful and beautiful people are good, minus a few wicked stepmothers. With stepmothers are generally bad, and so there's things in them that are absolutely valuable and things I wouldn't want to perpetrate. And it's partly the Arthur Rackham illustrations, which I do want to keep mostly, although there's some drawings in his larger body of work in which trolls look like anti-Semitic caricatures. The stepsisters in Cinderella, which you can see as Cinderella Liberator. I also reworked with his illustrations, are kind of portrayed as figures of ridicule because they're not pretty enough. And so there's so much to throw out, so much to keep. So my analogy is the old house that's a beautiful structure, but it has lead pipes, asbestos, dry rot, termites. You want to keep stuff, you want to get rid of stuff, you want to make it inhabitable for who we are now.
Indeed. They are very powerful and relevant stories. I'm curious, Rebecca, having read much all of your work, how early in your reading and writing life did fairy tales affect you? When did you first become interested in them?
That's lost in the mists of time. I think we start hearing fairy tales before we have a real register of books investigated, things we've read, because they often come before we've read them. I don't remember being told fairy tales. I know fractured fairy tales on Bullwinkle, which are also kind of like, contemporary deconstructions of the stuff of fairy tales, but more to just make fun of them on that wonderful sort of variety program for kids and adults that was Bullwinkle. And I also remember, so I have some vague sense of the Disney animated things, although happily I don't remember seeing Cinderella and those other ones where girls just slavishly have to be the perfect passive princess to get their man. But by the time I was a really young reader, maybe 8 or so, Andrew Lang's color books, the Green Fairy book, the Blue Fairy book, and those things had come my way, and lots of other stories of magic and enchantment and reworkings of old legends and myths. So, so it's not, I can't say when they began because I can't say I know they were ever absent.
Right, right. There's a concept of yours that I love. Actually, I first came across in Recollections of My Non-Existence, your powerful memoir, and that's the term forest of stories. And in both your fairy tales, you make a point of the multiplicity of stories. So I wonder if you could talk about this concept and why it was important to include it in your books.
Yeah, I'm just remembering I have a picture of myself and my younger brother dressed as fairy godmothers when I was probably going on 4, so he was not quite 2 and did not yet know that fairy godmother was not supposed to be his allotted role, although we could unpack that, and he's done a lot of magic in his day. But yeah, the forest of stories. I'm Cinderella Liberator. If it has an underlying principle, it's sort of kindness and finding your people and not letting people tell you you're worthless. And, because Cinderella is a very powerful story about an abandoned child, an abused child, an exploited child. Waking Beauty is more about the fact that we all have our story, but it's not the only story around. And literally, it starts with Sleeping Beauty's story, and then it goes on to, well, okay, so Sleeping Beauty's going to sleep for 100 years. What about her younger sister who's going to live through those 100 years and be awake a lot of the time? So the title of the book, Waking Beauty, is about the younger sister, but the book's actually in thirds. The first third kind of retells Sleeping Beauty, then she falls asleep. We switch to focus primarily on the younger sister and her feats and woes. And then I kind of fold in, because you can actually do anything you want as a writer and a fairy tale reviser, the Russian story of the Firebird and a poor boy named Atlas. But at a lot of different junctures, I like to bring up that everybody has their story, and it's something a lot of adults haven't learned. Hello, Elon Musk. And, we're all the hero or the victim in our own story, but everybody else is in a story they're at the center of. And I think becoming compassionate, becoming aware, becoming capable of hearing other people is the work we all need to do, and learning that other people have their stories, and there are different stories that are swirling all around you, but then also that you can choose stories is very much something that happens here. I remind people, the bad fairy doesn't get invited to the thing. I did not call a christening because I distanced myself from both royalty and Christianity in these books a bit. But the invitation falls out of the mailbag, and a mouse ends up under it. But the mouse's story, I say, is a separate story. The fairy godmothers have their stories. The wolves who show up in the middle of the book have their stories. So there's a sense that there's many stories around us, and as a kind of abundance, but also a kind of, what's the word? Not quite demand, not quite invitation, but that being aware that everybody else is really busy with their story is a good thing to remember. So maybe this is Rashomon for the under 12 set.
Indeed, that's very effective. I also love how you play on the traditional phrase, once upon a time. You sort of set a little math problem with that, and you keep multiplying it.
Yeah, when I stopped reading because you appeared, we'd gotten to 3 times upon a time. Can I just add work us up to 11 times upon a time? So I had, since 2 parents and 1 child make 3 times upon a time. Her parents had fairy godmothers, 7 of them. So we could also start 7 times upon a time. The first fairy's real name was Incandescent Lumina Popsicle Jones, and the second one's name was Dreamsicle Swantooth Felicidata. Another 5 were even worse. Everyone called them Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And it goes on from there to say that once upon a time plus twice plus 7 is 10 times upon a time. And then the younger sister, whose name is Maya, is born, and we get up to 11 times upon a time.
It's very effective. I love that.
And that's sort of, that's sort of the beginning of just acknowledging the multiplicity of stories and having fun with the process of revising a little. I just saw a post yesterday from a wonderful storyteller friend of mine reminding us that once upon a time is how a lot of English language fairy tales begin, but there's, other languages have other kind of wonderful sort of forms of introduction, of beginning, that kind of put you in the dream time, the long ago, the far away.
Okay. So Rebecca, I'm curious about, so these are really all ages books, but
Yeah.
definitely capture the things of fairy tales that we know in the English language. And I wonder how what a challenge and how much fun it was for you to write for younger people, but to keep it engaging for adults, as the best of children's literature always does. And also, how you balance, sort of the messages that you wanted to include, or the ideas and perceptions, and the pace of the story, the enchantment of the story.
Ooh, just all that? Okay.
All that.
Let me go at some of it. Yeah, I wanted them to be fairly accessible to kids, and I'm somebody who buys a lot of books because I'm an aunt 7 times over, a great aunt twice, and a godmother once. And there's now a lot of virtuous books for kids about why you should like this noble figure or why you should be interested in this thing that I find kind of dull. And I also find a lot of books that don't use language that I don't think is very inviting to kids. The vocabulary might be a little challenging. These books they're not Dr. Seuss first reader, words of 1 and 2 syllables books. But one thing I suspect is if you make a book pretty fun and pretty engaging, kids will stick with it. And kids spend their whole childhood and a lot of their youth being in a little over their heads because people are talking at levels they're gradually learning. But I also felt like I wanted to make them engaging for adults, because we all grew up on fairy tales and a lot of them are frustrating in some way. And like The Little Mermaid might be the worst one, where she just destroys herself to make herself palatable to some damn prince who probably can't even swim. And, but all of them with like, she's got to get the guy, the upward mobility, the good equals pretty, the ugly equals bad. There's a certain kind of, there's still a lot of enchantment, but a lot of dreariness. So I thought for people who already had the original versions somewhere in their psyches, giving them a revision where people don't have to get married. Princes also need to be liberated. And, to kind of fix the things that are problems in my kind of home renovation project was some of it. It really started, though, if I can narrate a bit, and this is more about Cinderella Liberator. I love independent bookstores. I'm grateful for that introduction. I am a friend of independent bookstores because they've been friends of mine since I was a kid, buying the Narnia books one at a time out of my allowance in this wonderful place called the Amber Griffin, run by a woman named Ann Knudsen when I was little in my otherwise pretty bleak hometown. And I'm also a frequenter of libraries, and the San Francisco Public Library I'm not sure how much it still has in the wake of the pandemic. It closed its big bookshop, but they have a donations bookshop, and they also sell stuff on paper, including illustrations from books that fell apart. And I bought one day a beautiful illustration from an old edition of Cinderella that just showed a girl in a ragged dress with 2 pumpkins. It was just kind of beautiful in itself. And I thought that's what I was buying. And then one day I turned it over and it had this wonderful passage in which Cinderella and Cinderella and the fairy godmother are at work getting her ready for the ball. They've turned the 6 mice into coach horses. And then the fairy godmother says something like, "What will we do for a coachman?" And Cinderella says, "I will get the rat trap." And I realized, like, oh, the really interesting thing going on in this story is not that a poor girl gets to marry a rich guy, this kind of horrible story. Like, what's that terrible movie with Julia Roberts?
Pretty Woman.
Yeah. But the really interesting thing is this sort of this friendship, mentorship, and kind of remaking the world with the fairy godmother, in which Cinderella is an active participant, and many beings are transformed, not just Cinderella. Mice become horses, a rat becomes a coachman, a pumpkin becomes a coach. You know, all these interesting things happen. And I sort of thought then I discovered the Rackham illustrations and thought I would rewrite the story. One of my great nieces is named Ella, and so I was just thinking I would just write it for her. I've often written silly poems and short stories for nieces and nephews and my friends' kids, and so I thought about it for about a year, and then I was actually in the house of a 99-year-old on a snowy day in Salt Lake City, and everybody else, I think, was going out skiing or something. And I just sat down and wrote it, and it was really fun to write. And often, it sounds boastful to say I wrote it in one sitting, but I wrote it in a year of thinking it through, and then it was just writing it down. And then I sent it to my agent with maybe we should publish this. And then Haymarket, my socialist publishers, took it upon themselves, and the wonderful designer Rachel Cohen there matched the Rackham illustrations to this new version of the story, and we were off and running. So it's really rethinking them has been really fun. How do you kind of solve the problems of our value? Well, these things still work with our values. These things need to be tweaked or adjusted. I think the first one in particular is very much about a kind of Buddhist sense of kindness, compassion for all beings. Do the lizards really want to be turned into footmen? Does the rat really want to be a coach? Well, in my version, a coachwoman. Do the mice want to be horses? One of my recent mottos I've put into service is consent is for everything. How do we address the fact that the wicked stepsisters are that way because their mom, instilled those values in them? I do feel that, when you see a 9-year-old who's racist or, mocks people with non-standard bodies or whatever, someone taught them to be that way, and they're not really autonomous making those choices yet. There's still time for them to unlearn it. So I needed to give the stepsisters time to become something else. And then, it was really fun. And to realize I've been around some movie stars and people with very public roles and seen how trapped they can be, to decide the prince is trapped. And it's not just that Cinderella needs to be liberated from being a drudge. The prince needs to be liberated from the confinements of wearing fancy clothes and being watched all the time and not being allowed to get dirty and do what he really wants, which, as it turns out, is to be kind of a farmer. So they kind of liberate each other from their allotted roles.
Yes, I love that. It makes such an exciting story. You write in Cinderella, liberator, that a liberator is someone who helps others figure out how to be free.
Yeah, there's a wonderful thing in Buddhism, the Bodhisattva vow, where you, contrary to a lot of people in the West think, you're not like hastening your route to enlightenment to get off the wheel of birth and death and just have, hang out in nirvana for eternity. The Bodhisattva vow is you vow to continue being reborn, to do your best to alleviate suffering. And it's this wonderful commitment where you're not focused on your own spiritual growth primarily, although a little spiritual advancement might help you be good at this task. You're focused on alleviating suffering, on really engaging. It's this kind of deep activist vow. And I don't think I'd pile on Buddhism for kids as like, you should know this, here's some values, kid, slurp them up. But it definitely has influenced everything I've written for the last 20 years. Hope in the Dark, Field Guide to Getting Lost, The Faraway Nearby, Orwell's Roses. You can find bits and pieces of Buddha's kind of more I wouldn't call them fairy tales, but kind of legends, teaching stories, parables, things like that in all of them. And so this is definitely a bit Buddhist inflected with kindness as a foundational value.
Indeed, very effective. The other thing you achieve in both these fairy tales is to remind us of the interconnectivity of life. The animals, are beings, sentient beings with feelings and love for their offspring and caring about place. And also in Waking Beauty, in the part that follows the traditional Sleeping Beauty, where the curse upon her is that she will prick her finger on a spindle and sleep for 100 years. So all the spindles and spinning wheels in the kingdom are destroyed. And then you talk about what that means for the populace. It's a different kind of interconnectivity.
Yeah, no, you think about the consequences. Okay, nobody can spin thread for 15 years, and I haven't really figured out exactly when and where this takes place, except that it takes place in a magical parallel, in a world where there are fairies and mermaids and golden, firebirds. And so yeah, no thread, no weaving, no fabric, no clothes. Let's think about weavers and tailors and things like that. And so there's a certain amount of class consciousness in it. Years and years ago, there's a wonderful architect I met through Mike Davis, the great writer, a great mentor, friend, may he rest in power. And Teddy Cruz, who grew up in Guatemala, wanted to do a project with me. We never actually got around to, but he wanted to take one of these super ginormous McMansions. There was one being built by that CEO of PeopleSoft that was going to be 70,000 square feet, and like if in the 50s, the average middle-class family had a 1,000 square foot home, you can see, okay, we don't want to put 70 families in there because that would get kind of busy. But Teddy, as an architect, wanted to redesign one of those things as essentially a one building village and have me kind of like work on it with him. And so it's like, okay, Sleeping Beauty's mother is a queen. I don't really like royalty, except drag queens. Let's hear it for drag queens for Story Hour. Florida, get the fuck over that bullshit. I've been drag queens all my life. They're the last people on earth who are likely to harm anybody. And they're really great and kind and fun and very much about liberation and joy. And so it's like, okay, queen, there will be lots of queens. And so there's some jokes in there. Anybody who loves drag queens will get. There's a queen of camping, and the, Sleeping Beauty's mother is just the song queen. She sings a song that makes the cherry blossoms bloom, but also because she's got a day job. She's a librarian, one of the best jobs on earth. Some of my favorite people on earth. The palace that used to be for royalty is now one of those Teddy Cruz style apartments, and it has a library, a museum, a ballroom. Everybody in the community gets to use it. It has apartments that people live in. So it's kind of fun looking at these revisions that are a bit like the ones we might want to make in real life. Like what do we do? Actually, San Francisco is full of old mansions that have been cut up into apartments. I lived in one for a while where I had a really wonderful attic that was kind of the fairy tale garret of my dreams.
Yes, I love that vision. And again, it's that community, that sense of connection, that people need each other, and we need other creatures in so many ways. Animals are always coming to the rescue or sparking adventures in fairy tales. And they talk. We can talk to them in fairy tales.
Mike Davis apparently liked to make bumper sticker slogans late in life. And I think his final one was like, let us shelter under each other or something like that. That was such a beautiful thing. And he was very much a Marxist and a leftist, but always from this kind of wellspring of deep kindness and generosity. And so the kind of Marxist bodhisattva. And so that now I know I'm not getting it exactly right, but to shelter under each other's care or something is such a beautiful concept. And it might be sort of the aspiration for the characters in these books. How can they find ways to care for each other? How can they get cared for? How can they, do what we're here to do. And so even the wicked fairy, the bad fairy, has a story, which is she's been bitter ever since another fairy's pet griffin ate her 1000th birthday cake. And she's one of those perfectionists. I was kind of making fun of a certain kind of leftist and Puritan who shows up, the perfect who's the enemy of the good, which is a wonderful phrase I use a lot. But I think there are people who are convinced that they're either perfect or perfect's appointed spokesperson, and they come along as the real enemies of the good all the time to kind of ruin the party, tell people they're not doing it right. You're at a climate protest, but you burn fossil fuel to get there, so you're bad and wrong. Like you hate, corporate America, but you're not, communicating entirely through smoke signals, so you're a sellout and a hypocrite. The perfect is a very noisome, shit-stirring enemy of the good, and so that's kind of how she's not even the bad fairy, she's the perfect fairy, which is, really bad.
Terrible bird, very disturbing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also kind of whiny, kind of like, why didn't I get mine? Somebody else got more than me, and whose fault is this? If you told her you liked her hat, she thought that meant you hated her shoes. And her favorite question was always, what's wrong with this? Except when it was, whose fault is this? She was the great killer of parties and the spoiler of games. That's a magical power you should try not to have. So
It's perfect. It's so human. It's so closely observed.
Yeah.
So, will you be writing more? Are there Little Mermaid calling to you for revision?
I'm thinking about what I do with the Little Mermaid, and which might involve scuba equipment and family values. Like, don't leave all your cool mermaid, people. But part of what drove these two is that Arthur Rackham's silhouette illustrations are so gorgeous and luscious and wonderful, and he only did them for 2 fairy tales. So I don't have an inherent, an existing out of copyright body of illustrations. Part of what I loved about them is they felt pretty racially indeterminate to me. And I love his other illustrations, but they're very much Northern European people. And that feels in a California that's already a white minority state, a US that will be a minority country before long, a white minority country before long. And these illustrations are not pretty likely not going to be seen as Black, although there's so many mixed race kids now. But I think if an Iranian kid, a Latin kid, an Asian kid might not feel like, oh, this story isn't about me because look at the pictures. And another thing that happened, because I live in San Francisco where we have cherry blossom festivals and Chinese New Year's, and we just celebrated Day of the Dead, and is that I brought in a lot of bits and pieces of the cultures that are around me, the cherry blossoms that the songs bring on are kind of cherry blossom festival. There's a quinceañera. The fact that you have your ball when you turn 15 is kind of a quinceañera reference. There's bits and pieces of lots of cultures in there, and so that was also but I am thinking about a couple other kids' stories. I used to get asked all the time whether I was either get asked if I was going to write novels or be asked when I was going to write novels. The idea being an idea that I hate very much, that somehow the novel is the very pinnacle of literature, and this must be what you aspire to, even if you're writing these other things. And it's like, no, I actually aspire to be an essayist, so I'm where I want to be. Thank you very much. And I'm not, the last time someone asked me that, I'm like, I'm not really into characters, plot, or dialogue, so that could be tricky. But I actually am for fairy tales. And, if I tilt this camera a little, you can see on that shelf a bunch of Isaac Dinesen stories, which I love because I have a fable-like quality. So yeah, I think there might be more coming, but either I'll ask somebody like my friend Tino Rodriguez, who's an amazing image maker and illustrator, or somebody to make images maybe. So
well, I hope so. There's certainly many artists out there that would be interested in. And I love that you talk about fables and fairy tales, because like poetry and essays, I mean, they're all dealing with life and they're narrative, but they're not necessarily fiction in the way we categorize it. And they're such deep reading experiences. I mean, I personally am a huge admirer of some essays. I think they're really important thinking works of art.
thank you. By the way, you're garbled some of the time, but
Yeah, I can hear that. I don't know
I'm
if
not sure what to do about it. I don't, maybe you don't have the good fortune to have San Francisco strength bandwidth, but you moved a little and it made it better. I was going to say, when the pandemic started, at the very beginning, when school got canceled, I'm like, oh, I'll go help my family because I have a niece with the goddaughters to whom these two, with two daughters who are my great nieces to whom these books are dedicated. Obviously, Ella gets Cinderella, so then I had to make the waking beauty in this book Maya for her younger sister Maya. It's also very much about sibling life, because so much of being one of two siblings is being constantly compared. Who's the good one, the pretty one, the smart one, the talented one, the whatever, and just kind of learning to coexist with somebody and share attention and stuff. So, and literally it's a book where we shift attention from who the story is always about to, what about her younger sister? And hey, what about this other kid across the mountains? But I was going to say, when the pandemic started, so it turned out I couldn't hang out with my nephews in Berkeley or my great nieces in the South Bay because we're all supposed to quarantine intensively. And I just felt for so many kids and so many people. And so I started telling fairy tales online, and I kept that going for the first month of the pandemic. You can still find them as a page on Facebook called Fairy Tales for Emergencies. I'd build a little set behind me. I still kind of do that for talks, as you can see. And I'd sort of greet, people would send in kids' names and I'd greet them, hello, so-and-so in Boston and so in Pittsburgh and so in Albuquerque, and weave things together, usually a few stories to fill up, 40 minutes or so. And it was really great. I got these huge audiences, but fairy tales felt so right for the pandemics. I felt, particularly if you're really young, this felt like a fairy tale. Suddenly you're really isolated. Suddenly you're not allowed to do the things you usually do. And suddenly you have to do all the stuff that doesn't quite make sense. And that's so much how fairy tales begin. One of my absolute favorite fairy tales is Hans Christian Andersen's The 12 Wild Swans, which is a retelling of an old Scandinavian story in which there's, the usual king, the usual dead mom. And in European stories, parents have to die, so kids start to have wild adventures. Parents being people who keep you safe by keeping you from having a real narrative, apparently. So the stepmother is an enchantress. She turns the 12 brothers into swans who become human, but only after dark, which I thought in Scandinavia would be really interesting. If you go far enough north, you have summers with no darkness, winters with almost no daylight. And then she just punishes the sister who runs away and lives in dire poverty. But another enchantress tells her if she knits these 12 garments out of stinging nettles, with her bare hands, stinging all the time, while remaining mute, she can disenchant her brothers. And like terrible things happen. A prince or somebody falls in love with her, but she never speaks, and so she gets framed as a witch, and she's crocheting away furiously or knitting away furiously when the brothers come down as swans to save her, and she throws these sweaters up, and like the pandemic for a kid must have felt like that. Your brothers have been turned into swans and flown over the water. You're not allowed to speak. You have to do these crazy, awkward things that don't make sense. So I did that for a while, and it got me deeper into fairy tales, scouring to find things to read. Ultimately, I read Subcomandante Marcos. who tells these wonderful parables with a beetle named Dorito, and Eduardo Galeano, who also is kind of a great fable teller. I'm never been. I love reading novels, except I can never find the novel I want to read. But I also love that literature, if what we call fiction, can be fables and legends and even ballads and things. I love Borges and Galeano and these other kind of storytellers so much. So yeah, there's probably more fairy tales and kids' stories to come.
That's excellent, and that's a wonderful reading list. Good recommendation of reading there. I'm going to check and see some audience questions here. I hope my sound is better. So the first question is asking if waking in the title of Waking Beauty is referencing woke.
There's definitely that joke in there. I wrote, and the word woke feels more and more like the property of resentful right-wingers. And, it started out as black slang, then it got picked up by white people who were black slang adjacent, I guess. And then it became this kind of term of derision, like political correctness. But also it's literally Sleeping Beauty. Okay, she sleeps for 100 years. So, the younger sister's awake, has a bit of insomnia and is awake a lot during, but you want to flip the title so you end up with Waking Beauty. So.
Yeah, it's perfect. Also, you make Maya an artist, which opens up a whole other take on magic.
Yeah, and I kind of hate how beauty works in fairy tales, that you get rewards for beauty. So it's also, she's an artist, and I write at one point, many years later, when they sang the story of Maya who drew the wolves away, some people would ask, was she beautiful? The people who knew her best would say, she was beautiful, but she was better than beautiful. Whenever she showed up, beauty showed up with her all over. And because she taught people how to see what was beautiful about smoke rising up or dew on grass or, snow falling on branches or things like that. In both books, I wanted to rethink what beauty is because it becomes such a nightmare for girls and women since nobody's ever beautiful enough. Your value is supposed to be your beauty. It's going to fade. You'll be judged by it. There will always be somebody to find a flaw. In Cinderella Liberator, I say, when you love somebody enough, they just look like love, and talked about how some people love, great full manes of hair and some people love waterfalls of hair, and trying to get over the idea that there's one way to be beautiful. So it's trying to fix stuff for girls. You don't have to fucking marry a prince. You don't have to be conventionally beautiful. There are many ways to be beautiful and all that kind of stuff without making it like eat your vegetables. I'm hoping it tastes like cream puffs.
Yes, I certainly wish I'd had this story when I was a girl. Another question from our audience is, how long have you been studying Buddhism?
Growing up in the Bay Area, Buddhism was kind of ambient, and my father, who was kind of a monster in a fairly fairy tale way, was fascinated by Buddhism. And I went to Green Gulch Zen Center with him and actually sat in the Zendo a few times as a kid. I did a Vipassana retreat, silent retreat for 2 weeks when I was 14. And people always say, speaking of fairy tales, wasn't it hard to be silent for 2 weeks? And I was like, I'd just been silent for 14 years, so whatever. And then in the 90s, I kept joking that when I grew up, I'm going to become a Buddhist. I knew it had something that I needed, an ability to deal with negative emotions, anxiety, kind of busy-mindedness, etc. And then finally, it was like a fairy tale in itself. So it's recounted in a field guide to getting lost. In the fall of 2001, I was having yet another crisis where I was obsessively running the stupid loop tapes we all run when our stories run us. And as I say in The Far Away Nearby, rather than we tell our stories tell us and tell us what to do. And it's like, I really need to get better at all this stuff. So I went to San Francisco Zen Center, which I lived near at the time. And the wonderful Irish Catholic abbot, Paul Haller, told this beautiful story like a fairy tale about a blind man who made a living by going around and selling these chocolates in the shape of turtles. And so they called him Turtle Man. And he laughed and said they weren't very good chocolates, but they always bought a box or two and then said they weren't very good and ate them anyway. But Turtle Man would cross the street by just standing on the corner, crying out for help for someone to help him cross. And Paul, who's a beautiful, very Irish storyteller, wove this whole thing about how we ask for help, how we get through. And it was a story that brought me in. And it's like, this is exactly where I need to be. This is exactly the food I need. And so I started going to San Francisco Zen Center regularly. Ultimately, I took the precepts with Blanche Hartman, who is a wonderful old woman born in Alabama in the 20s. Her father was a Jewish civil rights activist, and her husband had been blacklisted during McCarthyism. So she had this very political background, was very deeply kind. I took the precepts from her. And now the main form of Buddhism in my life is I'm close to Roshi Joan Halifax, who's a wonderful activist, Buddhist, feminist, teacher, who is the head of Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, which works very hard at what's called engaged Buddhism, encouraging people to work with prisoners or the homeless or on other, to apply their Buddhism to being a real bodhisattva and ending suffering for others. And but so the practice, I still have a very busy mind, and I'm a very bad Buddhist when it comes to sitting regularly, but it's been a really big part of my life and the life of a lot of other people. And I realized when Thich Nhat Hanh died and I saw the incredible outpouring in response, how much Buddhism has percolated into the culture, even from people who wouldn't think of themselves as Buddhist, who haven't consciously engaged with it. Ideas about kindness, about letting go, about being present, etc. Going back at least to Be Here Now from, why am I forgetting his name? Ram Dass, yeah, who is also a kind of mentor of Roshi Joan Halifax's. So, and it's one of the things that I think is really exciting and that I try and trace in my Hope work is how indigenous ideas, Taoist and Buddhist ideas, these kind of other worldviews and values have really percolated into North America, sometimes very perceptibly. And of course, there's a lot of indigenous and Asian people who are very cognizant of that, but also sometimes imperceptibly. And percolate is a good word, the way rain kind of, percolates through soil and brings, germinates the seeds. So,
listening to you naming all these really important, influential people, and I want to thank you for writing a really beautiful introduction to the last collection of essays by Barry Lopez. I just want to acknowledge his great wisdom and incredible nonfiction writing and his passing.
Yeah, no, Barry was, I wasn't close to him the way I was to Mike Davis, but I kind of had his blessing and encouragement, particularly when I started making maps. And ultimately, I got the Corliss Benefideo Award, which was named after a Barry Lopez character who's a master map maker in a short story he wrote that cartographers and I fell madly in love with, which was pretty great. But Arctic Dreams and Winter Count in particular, and some of his essays really helped me imagine what nonfiction writing could be, how poetic, how imaginative, how far-reaching. And so he was a mentor through his writing, and it was wonderful to be invited to write that introduction. What happens for us writers, and I'm sure this happens for you too, is when you take on an assignment, you think about it harder. And part of why I love writing is suddenly I'm thinking much harder about something that's been in my life, been around, that I think I've thought about. And often I change my mind. I feel like I understand it for the first time. And it was a real joy thinking really hard about Barry's work and how much it was both a kind of pilgrimage or quest. But the Holy Grail wasn't, some object at the end. The Holy Grail was to be in a quest, to be paying deep attention. And the word attention occurs constantly in those essays of just really showing up, really being present, being patient, so you can see those things that happen if you sit for hours in the cold to watch polar bears do their thing, or go back to a place for years, or listen to, and for Barry, listening to mostly indigenous people and scientists, the two people who could help him understand the land more deeply. And he was really early among white people and listening deeply to indigenous people and seeing them as fully present in the here and now and fully relevant, rather than, kind of simplistic figures who somehow gracefully disappeared in the 19th century, so we don't have to think about their rights and presence in the present. So Barry gave us a lot. And the wonderful thing about writers, whether it's Susan Sontag or Mike Davis or Barry Lopez and all the rest of them, and I'm writing something, now that references Jonathan Swift, is that the writing is more or less immortal.
Yes, and
the writing lives on.
Writing lives on, and sharing appreciation for it so keeps it vital and shares it. It reaches out to even more people. So I thank you for that. I guess my final question will be, what are you thinking about now? What are you working on besides the fairy tales? George Orwell's Roses came out not too long ago, but I know you're always busy.
I actually thought I was going to not write another book, and I was at a dinner party with a bunch of amazing people, including the great writer Adam Hochschild, and his wife, the great sociologist Arlie Hochschild, Annie Leonard, head of Greenpeace, Sony, head of Resilience Force. And I was like, oh, but I've given up writing books because I want to be a better climate activist. And I've started this project called Not Too Late to bring positive frameworks and positive stories about climate to try and assuage some of the climate defeat, despair, grief, anxiety we're seeing out there. And there's a real basis to feel pretty frightened about where we are, at the same time that the people who are deep in it are not hopeless and not despondent. They're like, bad things are going to happen, but there's a lot we can still do. It's really important that we do them. And the despair means thinking it's too late. So we started Not Too Late. I told them about it. They all looked at me and were like, Rebecca, this needs to be a book. So I emailed Anthony Arnov at Haymarket that night, like, hey, Thelma and my collaborator on Not Too Late, Thelma Young Lutuna Tabua, this wonderful Fiji-based climate activist in her 30s. Thelma and I think we want to do a book. Does Haymarket want to do it? And they said, oh yeah. And so by 10:30 the next morning, I could write to everyone at dinner like, okay, it's a book. You made me do it. We turned in the manuscript on September 15th. It's got a bunch of extraordinary climate people, including 2 IPCC scientists, the people who are producing those every 7-year reports on the state of the world from a climate perspective, other scientists like Dr. Jacqueline Gill, Dr. Farhana Sultana, but it also has Adrienne Marie Brown and Roshi Joan Halifax, among others, really speaking to the emotional core of the climate crisis. And so this is, and I'm actually giving a talk at Princeton on Tuesday. I'm packing up tomorrow and leaving, about the climate crisis as a storytelling crisis, because so all of our crises are at least in part story crises. And we've got these ridiculous stories trying to swing the vote to Republicans happening right now about crime waves that aren't really happening, and blaming the Biden administration for the fact that the fossil fuel industry jacked up their prices because they could. And but with climate, telling better stories means saying, no, we're not in an age of abundance and wonderfulness. We need to renounce all that to enter an age of austerity. The age, responding to the climate crisis can bring us out of the poverty of hopefulness, the poverty of connectedness, the poverty of living in poisoned politics and poisoned air and water and oceans from fossil fuel, to an age of abundance. We can rethink, we can tell better stories about power. Power does not exist in high profile people with official positions of power. There's grassroots power that can be more powerful than them. So it's very much a book. It's literally, well, Thelma's wonderful subtitle. The book is called Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility. And really looking at some of the great solutions that are out there, the renewables revolution, what the scientists really say, what makes them hopeful, and also how to deal with the emotions that the climate crisis stirs up in a lot of people. So that's the next project, and it's a book, but it will also be a talk series. I'll definitely go on the road to try and bring the gospel according to Thelma and Rebecca and our 20 amazing authors to people. It will, we do social media every day of good climate stories, both good facts and good frameworks on Twitter and Facebook, although Twitter's going to take a break, both because Twitter's gone haywire and Thelma's about to have a baby, but I'll plod on Facebook. So that's what I've been working on. And it took me a long time to try and find my place in the climate crisis. I kept waiting for someone to tell me what to do. And finally, I was like, people really need hope. They really need frameworks that let them have better senses of how change happens, where power resides, than they get from the mainstream. And I think I can do that. So I just need to bring that to climate and work with people in the climate movement. And it's been pretty exciting and rewarding. And, because to do nothing in the face of this, or to feel like I'm not doing anything, feels terrible. I'm on a board and 2 advisory boards too. I'm mostly about climate now. But it's also a storytelling crisis, and a crisis we solve in part by telling better stories about change and power and possibility. So that's both a book and, a broader project right now.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. That's very impressive, and I really look forward to it. It's so necessary. We're the narrating animal. We can control stories and tell different.
Yeah. No, The Far Away Nearby was also about that, about how we create story, how a story can be your magic carpet you escape on, your wings, or it can be your prison, your ball and chain. Because there's this period where everybody was like, oh, stories are wonderful, aren't they? And there's stories about racial inferiority and how heterosexuality is the only natural thing, and why slavery was a benign institution. And there are terrible poisonous stories out there too. So, being skillful with stories is something I think everybody can work at. We tell stories for a living, but all of us are storytellers, and you narrate who you are and what you're going to do, who the people are around you every day. Like you blow a tire or lose your purse or something, and you start to tell stories about, oh, I'm this, I know how to deal with this, or this is so-and-so's fault, or why does this always happen to me? So learning to change the story is one of life's great skills. And Buddhism was partly learning how to pause the story, and recognize that, oh, I'm telling a story now, and I'm actually the storyteller. The story is not just the reality that I run in my loop tapes.
You are so inspiring.
Thank you so much.
You are so inspiring. And I've read your work and I've loved reading it, but I rarely get to hear you speak. So just listening to you and how your mind works and the beauty, what I find in your work is just like how far reaching it is, the breath with which you go from one thing to another, and the flow, and how you bring all of these various ideas together is just really, I don't want to say magical, but it is really brilliant. So
Thank you so much.
thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Donna, for your great questions. Thanks to all of our viewers. Thanks to Haymarket Books. And I hope we will see you in person the next time. And meanwhile, if you're in Miami, you want a copy of Waking Beauty, it's in all of our stores. So come by and see us. And thank you so much again for today. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. What a pleasure. And everybody, what's your story? I hope you find beautiful ones to get through all this crazy stuff we're getting through. So
Thank you so much. Peace to
We need
you.
the hope. Bye.
Bye, Christina.
everyone.
Rebecca. Thank you so much.